I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter.
The wind howled like something alive the night Clara Bennett realized she had nowhere left to go. Snow slammed against the thin windows of the small schoolhouse she had fought to protect, shaking the glass as if the storm itself had come to push her out. Inside, the fire in the iron stove was dying. So was the last piece of hope she had carried into this valley. That morning, the board had made their decision. Funding was gone. Too few children. Too many hard winters. The town was barely feeding itself. They had thanked her for her service, avoided her eyes, and handed her a folded paper that ended her position. No savings. No family within 1,000 miles. No offer of another post. Just silence and snow. She packed slowly, placing worn readers and arithmetic books into a wooden crate. When she had arrived 2 years earlier, she had believed she could change things. She thought if she taught the children to read and write, they would grow into something stronger than drought and debt. Instead, the drought had swallowed the town whole, and her faith along with it. A hard knock struck the door. 3 sharp raps. Confident, certain, her breath caught. She knew that knock. When she opened the door, wind burst in around a tall figure wrapped in a long black coat dusted white with snow. Matthew Carter stepped inside, without waiting to be invited twice. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked lightly with gray at the temples. His blue eyes were steady, but carried the weight of someone who had buried too much. He was the wealthiest rancher in the county, owner of land that stretched farther than most men could ride in a day. Firm in business, quiet in town meetings. Widowed 3 years now. People respected him, but they also kept their distance. "I won't stay long, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low and rough from the cold. "May I speak with you?" "You're already inside," she replied, trying to keep her tone even. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snow slid from his shoulders and melted onto the wooden floor. "I heard about the board," he said finally. "It's settled," she answered. "They've made up their minds." He glanced around the small room. The chalkboard, the tiny desks, the maps pinned carefully to the wall. Proof of work that now meant nothing. "I have a proposal," he said. She stiffened. "I'm not in the mood for charity." "It isn't charity." She folded her arms, waiting. "My boys need a mother," he said plainly. "And you need a place to stay." The words hung in the air like smoke. She stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "You're asking me to marry you." "Yes." There was no softness in how he said it. No romance. Just fact. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied. "You kept that school open when others would have quit. My sons need someone steady. Someone kind. Not someone afraid of hard days." "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you need?" His jaw tightened slightly. "They come first." She looked away, her heart pounding. Marriage had never been part of her plan. She had chosen teaching because she wanted independence. She had told herself she would never tie her future to a man's name. "This would be an arrangement," he continued. "You would have your own room. Respect. The boys would carry my name, as they already do. Nothing more would be expected than what we agree to. And if I refuse," he didn't hesitate, "then I wish you well. But winter is not forgiving." The truth of that pressed in harder than the wind outside. She had enough money for perhaps a week in the boarding house. After that, she would be forced to leave the valley with no promise of work elsewhere. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It isn't," he replied, "but it is practical." She studied him carefully. There was no mockery in his eyes. No pity, only a kind of tired honesty. "What are your sons like?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Ethan is 9. Quiet. Watches everything. Caleb is 6. Angry at the world and not sure why. Because their mother died." "Yes." "And you think I can replace her?" "No," he said firmly. "No one can. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help us survive." Silence filled the schoolhouse again. The fire popped softly in the stove. She had imagined leaving this valley on her own terms one day, perhaps to teach in a larger town. She had never imagined standing here, measuring her future against a stranger's offer. "I would have conditions," she said at last. A faint flicker of relief passed over his face. "Name them. I continue teaching. Your sons, at least. Properly." Not just chores and ranch work. He nodded. Agreed. And I keep my independence. I will not be ordered about like hired help. You wouldn't be. She swallowed. And if, after a year, it does not work, then we part respectfully. She searched his face for any sign of deception. She found none. Only exhaustion and something else. Fear, perhaps. Not for himself. For his children. Outside, the wind roared again, rattling the door. I will need time, she said softly. You have until morning, he replied. The roads will close after that. Of course they would. He placed his gloves back on slowly. I won't pretend this is ideal, he added, but it could be decent. After he left, the schoolhouse felt smaller than ever. Clara sat at one of the tiny desks and stared at the empty room. She had spent her life believing that love should come first. Yet love had not come. Survival had. She whispered into the silence. What choice do I truly have? And for the first time since arriving in the valley, she realized that strength did not always mean standing alone. She did not sleep that night. Clara sat on the narrow cot in the corner of the schoolhouse, wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the wind drag its nails across the walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw two little boys she had never met, standing in a house that no longer had a mother's voice in it. Then she saw herself, alone, stepping off a train in some distant town, clutching a single suitcase, starting over again with nothing but hope and a tired smile. By dawn, hope felt thin. She folded her clothes carefully, more out of habit than certainty. When the first pale light touched the snow outside, she buttoned her coat and stepped into the cold. The valley looked empty, as if the storm had erased every path. Matthew Carter was already waiting beside his wagon. He studied her face for a long second. You've decided. Yes. Her voice almost failed her, but she forced it steady. I'll come for 1 year. He nodded once, as if this were a business deal concluded over coffee instead of a life being altered. He took her single suitcase and placed it in the back. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Snow stretched in every direction, broken only by fence posts and distant cattle huddled against the wind. Clara kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. You don't have to speak if you're angry, Matthew said suddenly. I'm not angry. What are you then? She looked straight ahead, afraid. He absorbed that without argument. So am I. That surprised her enough to turn her head. His jaw was set, but there was no pride in his admission. The ranch house came into view just before noon. It was large but plain, built for function more than beauty. Smoke rose from the chimney. A hired hand took the horse without speaking. Inside, warmth wrapped around her, along with the faint scent of stew. The house felt lived in but not lively. Too quiet. They're in the kitchen, Matthew said. Clara removed her gloves slowly, steadying her breath. This was the real test. Two boys sat at the wooden table. The older one, Ethan, had dark hair like his father and eyes that missed nothing. The younger, Caleb, had lighter hair and a restless energy even while sitting still. Both stared at her as if she were something carried in by the storm. Boys, Matthew said, firm but gentle. This is Miss Bennett. Clara forced a small smile. Hello. Ethan nodded politely. Caleb did not. Is she staying? Caleb asked bluntly. Matthew hesitated just a fraction. Yes. For how long? A while. Caleb's jaw tightened. We don't need another one. The word struck harder than Clara expected. Ethan shot his brother a warning look. Dad said to be respectful. I'm being respectful, Caleb muttered, though he wouldn't look at her. Clara knelt, so she was closer to his height. You don't have to like me, she said softly. But I won't disappear tomorrow. His eyes flickered to hers, searching for a lie. He said nothing. Matthew cleared his throat. Miss Bennett will be staying in the East Room. Clara, she corrected quietly. If I'm to live here, you may call me Clara. The boys exchanged a look. That seemed to matter more than she expected. Later, as she unpacked in the small bedroom overlooking the fields, she noticed something on the dresser. A framed photograph. A woman with warm eyes and a soft smile, holding a baby Caleb while Ethan leaned against her shoulder. She understood then. She was not stepping into an empty space. She was stepping into someone else's place. There was a knock at the doorframe. Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets. "You really were a teacher?" he asked. "Yes. Will you still teach? If you'll let me." He stepped inside slowly. "Mom used to read every night. Dad doesn't like reading out loud." Clara smiled faintly. "Your father seems like a busy man." "He doesn't laugh much anymore," Ethan added, almost to himself. That night at supper, conversation was stiff. Caleb pushed peas around his plate. Matthew spoke mostly about the weather and cattle. Clara listened more than she talked, trying to learn the rhythm of this house. When dishes were cleared, she found herself alone in the kitchen with Matthew. "They don't hate you," he said quietly. "I know, but they might test you." "I was a school teacher," she replied gently. "I'm used to being tested." For the first time, a corner of his mouth lifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. After the boys went to bed, Clara stood by the window, staring at the dark fields. The weight of what she had done pressed against her chest. She had traded one uncertainty for another. Matthew joined her, keeping a careful distance. "If at any point you regret this," he said, "you may tell me." She looked at him. "Regret usually comes after we've had time to think." "And have you?" "Yes." She swallowed. "I think. I didn't come here to be saved. No, I came because I refused to disappear." He studied her in silence. Something shifted in his expression. Not ownership, not expectation, but respect. Upstairs, a door creaked open and small footsteps crossed the floor. A moment later, Caleb's voice drifted down the hall, trembling in the dark. "Dad!" Matthew was already moving toward the stairs. Clara followed without thinking. Caleb was standing in the hallway when they reached the top of the stairs, his small hands fisted in his pajama shirt, his face pale in the dim lamplight. "I had that dream again," he whispered. Matthew crouched in front of him. "The storm?" Caleb nodded, his chin trembling. "She was calling me, but I couldn't find her." The words settled heavily in the hallway. Clara felt like an intruder in something sacred and broken. Matthew pulled his son into his arms without hesitation. "It's just a dream," he said softly, though his own voice carried strain. "You're safe." Caleb clung to him tightly. Over his father's shoulder, his eyes met Clara's. There was no anger in them now, just fear. Clara stepped closer, moving carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. "When I was little," she said gently, "I used to dream that I was lost in a field of tall grass. I would call for my mother, but the wind would answer instead." Caleb blinked. "Were you scared?" "Very," she admitted. "But my mother told me something once. She said dreams are our hearts trying to understand things that hurt too much in the daytime." "You seem to think about that." Matthew glanced up at her, surprised. "So what did you do?" Caleb asked quietly. "I learned to leave a lantern on," she said with a small smile. "Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I wanted to remind myself that morning always comes." Caleb hesitated, then slowly loosened his grip on his father. "Can the lantern stay on?" Matthew nodded. "Of course." Clara reached over and turned the hallway lamp a little brighter. The warm glow softened the sharp edges of the night. "I can sit here for a while," she offered, not looking directly at Matthew, but meaning it for both of them. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then surprised them both by holding out his hand. She took it. Matthew helped him back into bed. Clara sat on the wooden chair beside him, her hand resting lightly over his smaller one. After a few minutes, his breathing slowed. His grip relaxed. Matthew stood in the doorway, watching. When Clara finally stepped out into the hall, she found him still there. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." Their voices stayed low, careful not to wake the boys. "You handle them better than I do," he admitted. She shook her head. "No, he needed his father. I was only support." Matthew leaned back against the wall, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, he looked less like a powerful rancher and more like a tired man who hadn't rested in years. "I don't always know what they need," he said. "I provide. I work. I keep the ranch running. But at night," his voice faded. "At night, there's no work to hide behind," Clara finished gently. He gave a small nod. "Losing someone doesn't end after the funeral," she continued. "It changes shape. It shows up in dreams, in silence, in small questions children don't know how to ask." He looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You've lost someone." "My parents," she said simply. "A fever swept through our town when I was 19. I learned quickly that being strong and being unhurt are not the same thing." The house was quiet again. Snow tapped softly against the windows. "Why did you never marry?" he asked before he could stop himself. She considered the question. "Because I wanted to choose love," she answered honestly. "Not security." "And this?" he asked, not unkindly. "This is survival," she said. Then, after a pause, "And maybe something else. I don't know yet." He didn't push further. The next morning began earlier than she expected. The ranch woke before sunrise. Boots on wood floors. The smell of coffee. Cattle lowing in the distance. Clara stepped into the kitchen to find Ethan already dressed, reading from a worn book while stirring his oatmeal. "You wake up early," she observed. He shrugged. "Dad says work doesn't wait." "And do you?" He looked at her carefully. "Sometimes." She smiled faintly. "After breakfast, we'll set aside an hour. Reading. Writing. Proper lessons. Even in winter. Especially in winter." Caleb stumbled, and moments later, hair messy, eyes cautious but less guarded than the night before. "Is the lantern still on?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "And it will be tonight, too." Matthew entered, pulling on his gloves. He watched the three of them quietly. Ethan asking Clara about a word he didn't understand, Caleb climbing into his chair without protest. Something in the room felt different. Not fixed, not healed, but shifting. As Matthew moved toward the door, Clara stopped him. "You said this was an arrangement," she said softly. "It is." "Arrangements can change," she added. He held her gaze. "Only if both people are willing." She didn't answer that. Not yet. Outside, the wind had calmed. The valley lay wide and white under a pale sky. Inside the ranch house, for the first time in a long while, there was the faint, careful sound of something beginning. The days that followed were not graceful or smooth. They were awkward, uneven, filled with small mistakes that made Clara question herself more than once. On her third morning at the ranch, she burned the biscuits. Caleb stared at the blackened bottoms, as if it were proof she did not belong there. "Mom never burned them," he said without thinking. The words slipped out, and the moment they did, his face changed. Guilt replaced defiance. Clara forced herself not to flinch. "Then your mom must have been very patient with her oven," she replied lightly. "I suppose I'll have to learn." Matthew, sitting at the head of the table, watched her closely. He seemed ready to step in, to defend or redirect. She appreciated that he didn't. Ethan quietly reached for one of the least damaged biscuits. "They're not that bad," he said, taking a bite, even though they clearly were. Caleb hesitated, then copied his brother. It wasn't about the food. Clara understood that. It was about testing whether she would break. Later that afternoon, she began proper lessons at the kitchen table. She brought out paper she had saved from the schoolhouse and a small jar of ink. "We already know how to read," Caleb muttered. "Then you won't mind proving it," she said gently. Ethan sat straighter, curious despite himself. Clara noticed how quickly he picked up new words, how carefully he formed each letter as if afraid of making a mistake. Caleb was different. He fidgeted, grew frustrated when his handwriting slanted the wrong way, and once shoved the paper aside. "I can't do it," he snapped. Clara didn't raise her voice. She slid the paper back toward him. "You can't do it yet." He glared at her. "Dad doesn't make me write. I'm not your father." For a second, the room went still. Caleb's eyes filled before he could stop them. "You're not my mother either." There it was. The wound, open and honest. Clara set the pen down. "No," she said softly. "I'm not." Silence stretched between them. Ethan looked down at his page, pretending not to listen. "I'm not here to replace her," Clara continued. "And I never will. But I am here. That counts for something." Caleb's shoulders shook once, quickly, as if he hated himself for it. "She used to braid my hair when it got too long," he whispered. "Dad doesn't know how." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "you could teach me how she did it." He looked up confused. "You show me," she added. "Tell me what you remember." It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't magic, but it shifted something small inside him. He picked up the pen again. That evening, Clara stepped outside to breathe. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the snow pale gold. The ranch looked peaceful from a distance, almost whole. Matthew joined her after a few minutes, his boots crunching against the frost. "They're different around you," he said. "Different how?" "Calmer, even when they're upset." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "Children don't need perfection. They need consistency." He studied the horizon. "I haven't been very consistent." "You've been grieving," she corrected. "There's a difference." He let out a slow breath. "I thought working harder would fix it, that if I kept the ranch strong, the rest would follow." "And has it?" He didn't answer. A long pause passed before he spoke again. "You're not what I expected." She almost smiled. "What did you expect? Someone practical, quiet, willing to follow rules. And what did you get? Someone who makes new ones." There was no anger in his voice. If anything, there was reluctant admiration. Inside the house, a loud crash suddenly echoed from the kitchen. They both rushed in to find Caleb frozen beside a broken glass on the floor. Milk spread across the boards. "I didn't mean to," he cried, panic rising fast. "I didn't mean to." Matthew's voice sharpened. "Caleb." Clara touched his arm lightly before he could continue. "It's only a glass," she said calmly, kneeling to gather the pieces. "We can clean it." Caleb's breathing was uneven. "You're going to send me away." The words stunned them both. "Why would we do that?" Clara asked gently. "Because I ruined things," he whispered. Matthew went still. Clara looked up at him, and in that glance she understood. This wasn't about milk. This was about a child who believed that if something broke, it must be his fault. Clara reached for Caleb's small hands. "Listen to me. Breaking a glass doesn't make you broken." He searched her face as if trying to find proof. "Everyone drops things," she continued softly. "Everyone makes messes. What matters is that we stay." Matthew swallowed hard. "She's right," he added, his voice quieter now. "No one's sending you anywhere." Caleb threw himself into his father's arms, crying in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before. Clara sat back on her heels, her heart aching. This house wasn't just missing a mother. It was missing reassurance. It was missing the simple promise that love didn't disappear when something went wrong. That night, after the boys were asleep, Matthew stood in the doorway of the kitchen. "I was too hard," he admitted. "You were scared," Clara replied. He looked at her for a long moment. "So are you." "Yes," she said honestly. "Every day." The truth hung between them, fragile but real. Outside, the wind had finally quieted. Inside, the house still carried grief in its walls. But now it also carried something else, small, imperfect acts of care. And sometimes, that was where healing truly began. The first real argument happened over something small. It was a pair of muddy boots left in the middle of the hallway. Clara tripped over them while carrying folded laundry and nearly fell. The basket tipped, shirts sliding onto the floor. She stood there for a second, staring at the boots, her patience thinner than she wanted to admit. "Whose are these?" she called out. Ethan appeared from the kitchen. Caleb peeked from behind him. No one answered. That silence told her everything. "Boots belong by the door," she said, trying to keep her tone steady. Caleb crossed his arms. Mom didn't mind. The words weren't loud, but they hit hard. Clara felt the sting, but she refused to let it turn into anger. "Maybe she didn't," she replied softly. "But I do, and we're all learning each other now." Caleb's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would shout. Instead, he grabbed the boots and shoved them toward the door. It wasn't an apology, but it was effort. That night, she cried quietly for the first time since arriving. Not because of the boots, not even because of Caleb's words. It was the weight of constantly stepping into memories that were not hers. She sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the photograph of the boys with their mother. "I'm not trying to erase you," she whispered to the still image. "I'm just trying to help them breathe again." There was a knock at her door. It was Ethan. He held a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," he said awkwardly. "For school." She wiped her eyes quickly. "May I read it?" He nodded. The essay was about storms. But halfway through it shifted. It spoke about how storms take things, and how sometimes the sky stays gray even after they pass. At the bottom he had written, "I think maybe the sky just needs time." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "This is honest," she said, "and brave." Ethan looked relieved, like someone had finally understood what he couldn't say out loud. Matthew noticed the change before he admitted it. The house sounded different in the evenings. There was quiet laughter now, the scrape of chairs during lessons, the soft murmur of Clara's voice reading aloud. One evening he paused outside the kitchen and listened. Caleb was arguing about the ending of a story. "That's not fair," the boy insisted. "He should have fought back." Clara smiled gently. "Sometimes fighting back doesn't mean swinging your fists. Sometimes it means staying kind when you want to turn hard." Matthew leaned against the wall, absorbing that. Staying kind. He wasn't sure he remembered how. A week later, the first real test came. A neighbor rode up with news that several cattle had broken through fencing near the north pasture. Matthew had to leave before dawn and wouldn't return until late. The temperature was dropping fast again. By afternoon, the pipes in the kitchen froze. Clara had never handled such things before. She wrapped the metal with rags the way she had once seen her father do, her fingers numb from cold. Caleb watched from the doorway. "Dad usually fixes it," he said. "Your dad isn't here," she replied, breath visible in the air. "So we will." It took hours. Her hand shook. At one point, she nearly gave up. But when water finally sputtered back through the tap, Caleb's face lit up. "You did it," he said, surprised. Clara let out a tired laugh. "No," she corrected gently. "We did." It was a small victory. But in that house, small victories mattered. That evening, Matthew returned exhausted, his coat heavy with frost. He stepped inside expecting quiet. Instead, he found the boys animated at the table. "She fixed the pipes," Caleb announced proudly before Clara could speak. Matthew looked at her, stunned. "Ow! Trial and error," she admitted. "And stubbornness." He let out a low breath, something close to a laugh. It felt unfamiliar on him. Later, when the boys were asleep, he found her rubbing warmth back into her reddened hands. Without thinking, he took them gently in his own. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he said. "But I wanted to," she answered. The honesty between them felt different now. Less like an agreement, more like partnership. Days turned into weeks. The sharp edges in the house softened. Caleb began leaving space for her at the table without realizing it. Ethan asked for extra lessons. One night, as Clara tucked Caleb into bed, he hesitated before closing his eyes. "Will you still be here when the snow melts?" he asked. It wasn't part of their one-year agreement. It wasn't something she could promise lightly. She brushed his hair back gently. "I'm here now," she said, "and I don't leave when things get hard." He studied her face carefully, then nodded as if that answer was enough for tonight. Downstairs, Matthew stood alone by the dying fire. He had asked for a mother for his sons. What he hadn't expected was that the house itself would begin to feel alive again. And what frightened him most was not the change, but how much he had started to need it. Winter did not loosen its grip easily. February came with sharper winds and heavier skies, as if the valley wanted to test them one more time. One evening, Ethan didn't come home at his usual hour. The sun had already dipped behind the hills, and the cold had started to bite harder. Clara stood by the window, trying not to let her worry show. Caleb paced near the door. "He's just slow," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Matthew was already pulling on his coat. "I'll ride out." "I'm coming," Clara said without thinking. He hesitated. "It's freezing." "So is he." There was no time to argue. They found Ethan near the creek, sitting on a fallen log, his shoulders stiff. His horse grazed nearby. He wasn't hurt. He was just still. Matthew dismounted first. "What happened?" Ethan didn't look at him. "Nothing." Clara stepped closer, snow crunching under her boots. "Nothing usually doesn't keep someone out past dark." He swallowed hard. "Tommy Briggs said Mom wouldn't have liked you here." The words landed heavily between them. Matthew's jaw tightened. Clara felt the familiar sting. Not anger, but the reminder that she would always stand in comparison to someone who could no longer defend herself. "And what did you say?" she asked gently. "I didn't say anything," Ethan admitted. "I didn't know what to say." Clara crouched so she could see his face. "You don't have to defend me." "But I wanted to," he said quickly, emotion rising. "I just didn't know how." She reached for his gloved hand. "The next time, you can say this. No one knows what your mother would think. But you know how you feel. And that's enough." He blinked, Holding back tears he clearly thought he was too old to shed. Matthew placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "People talk when they don't understand something," he said quietly. "It doesn't make them right." On the ride home, Ethan rode between them. That night, after the boys were asleep, Matthew stood in the kitchen, silent for a long time. "You didn't have to go with me," he said finally. "Yes, I did. You take on their pain like it's yours." She looked at him carefully. When you care about someone, their pain doesn't stay separate. His expression shifted. "And who carries yours?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think about that. "I suppose," she said softly, "I'm still learning to." He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt the warmth of him. "You don't have to carry it alone here." For the first time since she arrived, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. The first thaw came early that year. Snow melted into thin rivers that ran through the fields, and the air carried the smell of wet earth instead of frost. With spring approaching, the one-year agreement Clara had made began to hover unspoken over everything. She felt it in small moments. When Caleb reached for her hand without realizing it. When Ethan left his schoolwork neatly stacked for her to check. When Matthew lingered at the table after supper instead of retreating to his office. One afternoon, Clara found an old trunk in the attic while searching for spare blankets. Inside were dresses neatly folded, letters tied with ribbon, and a journal. She didn't open it. She closed the lid gently, her chest tight. Later that evening, she found Matthew on the porch. "I came across her things," she said carefully. He didn't ask how she felt about it. He just nodded. "I haven't had the courage to move them." "You don't have to," she replied. "Grief doesn't run on a schedule." He leaned against the railing. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" She considered that. At first, yes. But lately, she hesitated. "Lately, it feels like I'm living mine. Just differently than I planned." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "When I asked you to marry me, it was for the boys." "I know." But somewhere along the way, he admitted, voice low, it stopped being just that. Her heart beat unevenly. "This house feels steady again," he continued. "And not because of obligation. Because of you." She searched his face for practicality, for calculation. She found none. "I was prepared to leave after a year," she said honestly. "I told myself I wouldn't depend on this place. And now..." She glanced toward the open window where the boys' laughter drifted out. "Now I don't know who I would be without it." A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with truth. "I don't want another arrangement," Matthew said quietly. "I want a marriage." The difference was clear. Not survival. Choice. Clara felt fear rise again. But this time it wasn't the fear of losing herself. It was the fear of hoping. "I never needed rescuing," she said softly. "I know," he answered. "You rescued us." She shook her head gently. "No, we chose to stay. All of us. That's different." Inside, Kayla called out, "Are you both coming or what?" Matthew's mouth curved into a real smile this time. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a bargain made in a storm. It felt like something they were building, slowly, imperfectly, but together. And she realized something simple and true. Love hadn't arrived the way she once imagined. It had grown quietly, in lantern light, in broken glasses, in muddy boots left by the door. And sometimes, the strongest families weren't the ones that began whole, but the ones that chose each other after being broken. Spring settled gently over the valley, as if it had finally decided the ranch had endured enough. Snow gave way to soft grass. The creek ran clear again. Windows stayed open longer. And for the first time since Clara Bennett had stepped into that house, the air inside felt lighter than the air outside. The one-year mark arrived quietly. There was no formal mention of it, no marked calendar. But Clara felt it in the way her heart beat that morning. She stood at the kitchen table, watching Ethan explain a math problem to Caleb. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Matthew stepped beside her, coffee in hand. "You're thinking about it," he said. "Yes." He nodded once. "So am I." The boys looked up, sensing something serious in the room. Caleb frowned. "What?" Clara crouched beside him. "Do you remember when I first came here?" "You burned the biscuits," he said instantly. Ethan rolled his eyes. "That's not the point." She laughed softly. No, it isn't. Matthew set his cup down. His voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it. When Clara came here, it was supposed to be for 1 year. Caleb's face went pale. So she's leaving? The fear in his voice cut deep. Clara didn't hesitate this time. She shook her head. No. Caleb blinked. No, no, she repeated gently. I stayed because I needed shelter. But I'm staying now because this is my home. Silence filled the kitchen. Not heavy, not sad. Just full. Ethan stood slowly. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard, she said. Matthew stepped closer to her, not out of obligation, not out of arrangement, but because he wanted to. We started this as survival, he said quietly. But somewhere along the way, it became family. Clara looked at him. The fear she once felt about losing herself had faded. She had not disappeared here. She had grown. She had chosen. And that choice mattered more than any agreement made during a storm. Caleb threw his arms around her waist without warning. You can't ever burn biscuits somewhere else, he muttered. She laughed through tears. I promised to burn them only here. Even Matthew smiled fully now, the kind of smile that reached his eyes, the kind that hadn't been seen in years. That evening, they ate supper on the porch. The sky turned gold, then soft purple. The boys argued over chores. Clara corrected them gently. Matthew listened more than he spoke. Nothing was perfect. There were still memories in the attic. There were still hard days ahead. But the house no longer felt broken. It felt lived in. And Clara understood something she hadn't known when the wind had first shaken the schoolhouse walls. Strength was not about standing alone. Love was not always lightning and poetry. Sometimes love was staying when leaving would be easier. Sometimes family was not found in the plans you made, but in the promises you chose to keep. The valley had once swallowed her hope. Now, it had given her something better. Not rescue, not obligation, but belonging. And belonging, she realized, was worth every storm.